Good evening. This is our fourth part of our historical sketches on the history of Ukraine. And in the last episode we left the plot, we left the story when the first Ukrainian political party was established in the year 1900. In this episode we will review the stages, contorted and tortuous, the stages that led to the formation of a proper Republic of Ukraine in the second decade of the 20th century, in the 1920s. I hope we could finish with this episode, the series on Ukrainians' long history, up and bring it up to date, or at least to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. But I do not think we can make it. And this is simply because there are too many important historical elements that uniquely characterize the history of if you like, of Ukrainianness as a whole. Disregarding them, these points, would not be fair to even a concise rendition of history. And we have briefly to retract into the 19th century and look at that section of Ukraine called Galicia that was part of the empire of the Habsburgs. And included in this review are the smallest enclaves of Ukrainianness that at the time were also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but were distinct from Galicia. And these are names, or they are names, that have surfaced recently as part of the upheavals in Ukraine, but with which most observers, even those who want to be informed, are not too familiar with. I'm referring to the enclaves of Transcarpathia and Bukovina. And for those viewers who may object to so much detail, I say that they are right. But my counter-objection, or objections if you like, are that 1, there are no exams at the end of our historical sketches, and 2, the details show how many multifaceted and complex history is, and how easy and counterproductive it is to rely on cliches and ready-made slogans to form a personal judgment of people and events. And last, and perhaps not least, these lesser-known regions of already in themselves not so well-known regions, such as Ukraine, are absolutely beautiful, as you can see from these images. The hills of Bukovina, the Carpathian mountains of Transcarpathia are not as spectacular as the Alps, but are nonetheless beautiful. And the relative obscurity adds somewhat to their charm. And as I said, we will look at the Ukrainians who lived in that part of Galicia ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the way, do you remember why the Habsburg Empire that was eminently Austrian was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire? It was, relatively speaking, a recent historical development. In fact, the Habsburg Empire covered much of what today is Poland, today is Czech Republic and Slovakia, and the Ukrainian part of Galicia, plus all the northern Italy and almost all of the Balkans, that is in the 19th century. But why then Austro-Hungarian? And this Hungarian addition occurred in 1867 and was the last phase in the constitutional evolution of the Habsburg monarchy. Austria and Hungary became co-equal within the empire. In fact, it was called a dual monarchy, though there was really only one monarch, the Austrian emperor, who at the time of these events was the famous Franz Joseph. Foreign affairs and the military all fell under the government of Austria, but the other functions were divided between their two respective states. Now, the underlying motive for this development was to somewhat dampen the thrust, or if you like, lower the fever for independence that had fired and infected so many nationalities in Europe in the 19th century. By the way, the Habsburg Empire was the last evolution, believe it or not, of the Western Holy Roman Empire founded by Charlemagne in the year 1800, after the splitting away of France, which took about 3 centuries to complete, and after the devastation of the wars of religion that occurred in the 1500, 1600, and also after the decline of the Spanish Empire. But now back to Ukraine. In the last episode, we made reference to historical layers or components intersecting and interacting with each other. And we also made reference to two types of what we call nationalism: the state-imposed nationalism and the intelligentsia-imposed nationalism. We also mentioned two opposite principles, that of compatible identities and of mutually exclusive identities. To give you an example, should I say that I am an Oregonian from America, I would implicitly subscribe to the principle of compatible identities. However, if I said that I am an Oregonian but have nothing to do with America, I would subscribe to the principle of incompatible identities. Now, in the Galician part of Ukraine, things were even more complicated. And here is an attempt at a list of the layers intersecting and at times cooperating, at times conflicting with each other. And to make sure we always still talk exclusively of intelligentsia-imposed nationalism. There is the layer of ethnicity, and what are the criteria for identifying a clear and distinct ethnic group. There is the layer of national identity, and among the ethnic Ukrainians, some were Russophiles, that is, they subscribed to the idea of a political, literary, and romantic idea of a pantheon of Slavic nations. Then there were the Ukrainophiles, who said no, Russia and Ukrainian identities are incompatible. However, some Ukrainians living in Galicia were also Polonophiles. That is, like the Russophiles and the Ukrainophiles, they spoke Little Russ or Ukrainian, but used literary Polish for intellectual discourse. Then there was the layer of religion. In the Galician Ukraine, there remained a sizable number of old Ruthenians. And I'm not expecting you to remember, as we talked about this in the first or second part of the series, but after the Great Schism of 1054, that divided the world into Catholic and Orthodox churches, a group of Orthodox Christians split off and became de facto modified Catholics. Out of them, there rose the Ruthenian churches, or Ruthenian Church, later also called Greek Orthodox Church. The Ruthenians recognized the Pope of Rome as their church leader, but retained the rites, the custom, the celebration date of the Orthodox Church, and including the fact that they could marry. The Ruthenians, however, had an important role in the development of Ukrainian nationality feeling, and not so much among the intelligentsia, but among the peasants. And why? Because they had direct access to the people in their sermons, and of course to the youngster in their religious schools. Then there is another layer, the layer of language, which I mentioned already. This was a veritable hornet's nest. The Ukrainian language was called Little Russ, or Little Russian, and had been considered, as we saw before, a Russian dialect well into the second half of the 19th century. And it was the merit of the Ukrainian poet Shevchenko to raise Ukrainian from a dialect into a language. But in Western Ukraine, there was also the Old Slavonic, spoken and printed by the practitioner of the Ruthenian community, plus the various vernacular versions typical of all communities living in distinct areas and with little communications among each other. Of course, all this before radio and television. And last but not least, there was a dispute, or at least contrasting ideas, and not only about what the Ukrainian language should be, but even about whether the Ukrainian language should use Cyrillic or Latin characters, as you can see in this example. Now, then there was the layer of history. That is, how historical events affecting the Ukrainian ethnic group as a whole were given different interpretations, leading sometimes to paradoxical conclusions. Of this, of the rewriting of history, we have examples all the time, even today. You may have heard that the Prime Minister of the current junta in Kiev said that Russia had invaded Germany in World War II and that it was the Ukrainians who liberated Auschwitz, and this doesn't even require a comment. Then there is the layer of local government influence, and given the strong Polish influence in Galicia, the Polish authorities saw the Ukrainians as Poles, the Russophiles saw the Ukrainians as Russia, and the Ukrainophiles saw the Ukrainians, as something entirely different from the other two. And finally, there is the new layer of the class struggle, which was, relatively speaking, a new layer that came to a peak at the end of World War I with the Russian revolutions we know of 1917. And because, on top of the arguments about ethnicity, language, religion, history, Polonophilia versus Russophilia, there came like a storm the issue of class struggle, as I said, and more specifically of peasants against large landowners. We can easily see how almost impossible it was to make sense in what is today Western Ukraine or Galician Ukraine, to make sense of what a Ukrainian nationality meant, let alone a Ukrainian state. And all these layers or components acting together give rise to a very long chain of unexpected consequences. And, as we will see, paradoxically, the very essence, the core of a proper Ukrainian republic came into effect only in the 1920s as a result of the Soviet policies of the time. Still, at the end of the 19th century, there arose in Galicia a Ukrainian radical party advocating the transformation of society according to socialist principles. For them, however, independence was in a sense secondary to the socialist transformation of Galician Ukrainian society. They were joined by the Ruthenians, but not for long, and for the Russophiles were inclined to cooperate with the Poles against Austria, whereas for the Ruthenians the very idea of cooperating with the Poles was anathema. As I said, many layers intersecting with each other, creating altogether a very unstable structure. Meantime, as hostility was growing between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Tsarist Russia, Russia provided large funds to spread orthodoxy among Greek Catholics in Galicia and in Transcarpathia, and among other immigrants even in the United States. Therefore, we can say that orthodoxy was a political tool to spread Russophilism. Now, in the last episode, we have seen how, in the 1970s, Moscow was beginning to look with displeasure on the national movement in Ukraine proper and prohibited the use of the Ukrainian language in official matters and education. So, it fell to the Ukrainians living in Western Galicia to become the Piedmont of Ukraine. But why Piedmont? Piedmont, as you may know, was the old kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia in Italy, origin of the effort, the will, and the organization required to create a united Italy. Among the several groups aspiring to create their own national identities in the Dnieper right bank, in Galicia, Transcarpathia, and even Bukovina, just about all of them considered themselves the Piedmont of their own cause. But it fell on Ukrainian Galicia to become the Piedmont of Ukraine. Though it would take another 40 years before a Ukrainian republic was established, as I said, as part of the Soviet Union. Paradoxically, once more, Ukrainians in Habsburg, Austria had more legal and national rights than anywhere else. Ukrainian proper was part of Tsarist Russia instead, and in fact, after the demise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at least some Ukrainians of Galicia remembered with fondness the good old days of Emperor Franz Joseph. But the long era of the Pax Austria, of the Austrian peace, was soon to come to an end with World War I. Perhaps the best representation of the status of Ukrainians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire was given by a Hungarian movie spoken in German. They came out in 1984 and had the title of Colonel Redl. Now, Colonel Redl was a Ukrainian born in the city of Lviv, in German it's called Lemberg, and he was a Ruthenian, that is, as we saw, a Ukrainian paying allegiance to the old Ruthenian church. Redl is charged in the movie to find a few undisciplined officers to be tried and made an example of. In a dialogue with Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, Redl first suggests to use a lieutenant colonel from Budapest, but he cannot be Hungarian. The empire is a dual monarchy, and that would politically irritate the Hungarians. Nor he cannot be an Austrian, especially an aristocrat, as that would weaken the trust in the supreme Austrian command. He cannot be a Czech, as they would use the episode as an excuse of mistreatment and would fight for independence even more fiercely. He definitely cannot be a Jew, for at the time there had been the famous Dreyfus case in France, and there was danger of international indignation. Not to mention it would strain the emperor's contacts with the Rothschild Bank, and the bank which was vital to the interests of the monarchy. And finally, he could not be a Serb or a Croat, because the region was, and is still until recently, too dangerous. We must look elsewhere, said the prince to Redl. And he asks, what is your blood? And he replies, I am a Ruthenian, he says. Excellent, says the prince, we need a Ruthenian. See if you can find one. And the moral of this story, or this movie, is that the Ukrainians under Austria were politically expendable. One more anecdote, this time regarding Transcarpathia. Transcarpathia was attached to Hungary all the time, where the dominant group in Hungary were the Magyars. But in 1868 there was a drive towards liberalization, and from now on in Transcarpathia and Hungary, Slovaks, Romanians, Germans, Serbians, Ukrainians, you name it, would all be treated equally, provided they adopted a Magyar identity. But not all the Ukrainians living in Transcarpathia like the idea. And they refer to the Ukrainians who had decided or accepted to become Magyars as Magyarones, reminiscent of the macarones or macaroni, an Italian fare whose notoriety had probably clearly already spilled over their national border. Anyway, with this Magyarization of Transcarpathia outwent the hopes of the local Ukrainians for independence. And as I said, it was in Galicia and in Bukovina that the preservation of the national Ukrainian idea had to take place, because in Ukrainian proper, Tsarist Russia had changed its mind, as we saw earlier on. Had changed its mind about national language and other related issues. And now we come to an event that was going to turn everything upside down, World War I, with its million killed and million wounded. We could say that each war has both an official version, which seems true at face value, and the real version, which is usually not much talked about at the time, and it falls on the historians after the event is over to come up or to sound the bottom of the after times, as Shakespeare would say. And they find the core reasons, and the core reasons stand out more clearly. In the instance, the core reasons was that each of the great powers of the time, was afraid that its rivals would take advantage of the weakening of the Ottoman Empire. Russian Russia wanted to get hold of the Dardanelles and to have unimpeded access to the Mediterranean. Germany wanted to build a railway line from Istanbul to Baghdad, which was vehemently opposed by England. France had been at odds with Germany over North Africa and African in general. Russia was blowing on the fire of nationalism in Serbia, and finally there was the assassination, as you know, of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and the beginning of the war of World War I in earnest. As usual, the first people to suffer the consequences of war are often the people who have absolutely nothing to do with it. At the onset of the war, Russian forces invaded Galicia, and during their first retreat, the Austrian army took revenge against many unwary Ukrainian inhabitants of Galicia, whom they considered Russian spies. Why? Because when they asked to identify themselves, the peasants would reply that they were Rusin, which to an Austrian or a Hungarian that didn't know any better, it sounded like Russian. Therefore, many Russophiles, Ukrainophiles, and Greek Catholic or Orthodox peasants were shot, hanged, or in turn corralled in equally infamous internment camps, concentration camps. And these are the inevitable facts of war. But in that instance, they are particularly important. And why? Because the resentment between Russophiles and Ukrainophiles in Galicia, which as we said today is Western Ukraine, started right there, when each party accused the other of having aided and abetted the local Poles and the Austrians in their anti-Russian campaign. During the war and after these initial events, Austria appointed the first Ukrainian to an imperial cabinet, Minister of Health of all ministries, but this was too little, too late, because an event occurred in Russia that changed the course of history, even our own history. We are used to remember the Russian Revolution as one event that occurred in October 1917, but things, as usual, are more complicated than simplifications. In March 1917, a massive protest of women against food shortages broke out in Petrograd. And what's in a name? A city made by any other name is still a city. But in 1914, the name of St. Petersburg sounded way too German, so they changed it to Petrograd, which then became Leningrad. And now, as you know, it is finally back to St. Petersburg. Anyway, in March 1917, the imperial troops were called out, but they refused to fire on the crowds. They joined the workers and established the council or Soviet, because Soviet means council, a council of workers and soldiers' deputies. The example was followed in various places inside Russia. However, the Soviets, that is, the councils, gave the responsibility to the deputies in the Duma, or Russian Congress, on the business of dealing with the shortages and of ending the war right away. In turn, the Duma representatives and the Russian High Command convinced the Tsar Nicholas II that he should abdicate, which he did. And therefore, notwithstanding what happened afterwards, the Russian monarchy came to an end without any bloodshed. And with the monarchy gone, the liberal members of the Duma wanted to become what today we would call a parliamentary democracy, and they formed a provisional government. But that did not resolve the problem of the food shortages. The provisional government could not impose its authority on the empire. Therefore, on the one hand, there were the Soviet councils of workers and soldiers, and on the other hand, there was a provisional government with some individuals belonging to both the government and the Soviet Council. And one of the names, a name that you will recognize, was that of Alexander Kerensky. But soon, the Soviets and the Duma were at loggerheads. The biggest item of contention was the war. The provisional government decided to remain an ally of what at the time was called the Entente, the allies of France and England, and to continue the war. But the masses were becoming more and more distressed. The peasants wanted a redistribution of land, and the workers wanted food and control of the factories, and last but not least, the national minorities that we spoke about wanted independence. In Ukraine, the revolution started more or less at the same time as the revolution in Petrograd in 1917, and it was to last until 1920, when finally the situation in Europe began to stabilize, and Ukrainians found themselves living, in the interim, the Ukrainians found themselves living in 4 states: Soviet Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. However, only the Soviet Union state was to survive those upheavals and that post-war confusion. In time, it managed to assemble all the disparate Ukrainian regions under one state, the Ukrainian Republic. When and where, I mean in the Soviet Republic, in the Soviet Ukrainian Republic, the grievances about use of language, culture, education, etc. were resolved in the complete favor of the Ukrainian nationalists, as we will see next time. The inaudible and noiseless foot of time, as Shakespeare would say, alerts me that we were running out of it. I will thank the crew and our director, Kat Iverson, for her patience and skill. Thank you for watching, and until next time, good night.